In the desolate, wind-scoured expanse of the Serafina Peaks, where granite teeth gnashed at a steel-gray sky, an impossible scene was unfolding, a secret held by the gnarled junipers and the stoic, silent stones. It was a tableau that defied every known law of the wild, a paradox whispered on the currents of the high-altitude air. A bobcat, a creature of shadow and instinct, a miniature ghost of the mountains, was holding a lion cub captive. But this was no simple act of predation. It was something far stranger, something infinitely more complex and heartbreaking. The bobcat, a female whose ribs corrugated her pelt like washboard roads, was gaunt with a hunger that should have driven her to madness. Yet the cub, a ball of tawny fluff and confused, clumsy paws, remained untouched, unharmed. He was not prey. He was a prisoner of a bewildering, desperate affection. She had found him days ago, a shivering, mewling creature alone in a world too big and too cold. His own pride vanished, a mystery lost to the unforgiving landscape. And, in him, she had seen not a meal, but a ghost. A ghost of the tiny, spotted bodies that had been stolen from her own den by the silent wings of a great horned owl just weeks before. Now she was a mother again, her grief transmuted into a fierce, obsessive guardianship. She would hunt, her belly aching with emptiness, and bring back a meager ground squirrel or a vole, nudging the pathetic offering not to her own mouth, but to the lion cub. He would sniff at it, his instincts not yet tuned to such humble fare, and she would watch with an agony of patience, her own starvation a distant hum beneath the roaring fire of her misplaced maternal love. This was the crisis, a silent, desperate drama playing out on a lonely ledge. The cub, who would one day be a king, was being kept alive by the thinnest of threads, held by a creature a fraction of his potential size, a creature who was herself wasting away. It was an alliance against all logic, a bond forged in shared orphanhood and profound, untranslatable loss. When the first reports came in, a garbled message from a terrified hiker who had stumbled too close, the authorities reacted with predictable alarm. A predator, unstable, with a creature that did not belong in these mountains. It was a problem to be solved, a situation to be neutralized. The initial assessment was stark and clinical. The bobcat was a danger. The lion cub was in mortal peril. The narrative was written before the first chapter had even been truly read. A tragic, violent end was not only inevitable, it was imminent. The stakes were absolute, a life-or-death equation scrawled across the cold face of the mountain. But they had not seen her eyes. They had not seen the way she curled her emaciated body around the cub as the temperature plummeted at night, a living shield against the encroaching frost. They had not seen how she groomed his dusty fur with a rough, tender tongue, a ritual of love she was compelled to perform. They saw a kidnapper and a victim. They did not yet understand they were witnessing a miracle and a tragedy intertwined and inseparable, a story that would challenge the very definition of what it means to love, to lose, and to survive in a world that often seems to have no room for either. The wild, in its infinite brutal poetry, had created a situation so delicate, so fraught with peril, that any wrong move would shatter it into a million pieces of dust and sorrow. Into this fragile, impossible world, humanity was about to intrude, armed with logic and tranquilizer darts, utterly blind to the sacred, heartbreaking truth of the scene they were about to disrupt. The question was not whether they would intervene, but whether they could ever possibly understand. The fate of two species, bound by a grief that knew no name, hung in the balance, waiting for the arrival of a savior or an executioner. The first vehicle to arrive churned up a cloud of ochre dust, a jarring intrusion into the sanctified silence of the peaks. Out stepped Ranger Eva Rostova, her uniform crisp, her expression a mask of professional resolve. She was sharp, efficient, and saw the world through a lens of protocol and pragmatism. Her eyes, scanning the distant ledge through high-powered binoculars, confirmed the reports. A North American bobcat, an African lion cub. It was an ecological absurdity, a biological impossibility. In her mind, the equation was simple. An aberrant predator, likely rabid or psychologically damaged, was preventing the rescue of a displaced, exotic animal. The plan was already forming, a clean, three-step process. Establish a perimeter. Get a clear shot with a tranquilizer dart. Retrieve the cub and transport it to the nearby Seraphina sanctuary, from which it had almost certainly escaped. The bobcat, depending on its condition, would be assessed, likely euthanized. It was a regrettable but necessary procedure, a neat and tidy solution to a messy, unnatural problem. Her voice over the radio was calm, clipped, and authoritative, a voice accustomed to command and control in the face of nature's chaos. To her, this was just another, albeit stranger, form of chaos to be managed. But then another vehicle arrived, lumbering up the trail with a slowness that seemed almost meditative. It was an old, battered pickup, its paint faded by years of sun, and its fenders scarred by encounters with the wilderness. From it emerged Dr. Eris Thorne. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from the mountain itself. His face a road map of canyons and ridges, his eyes the color of the deep, shadowed pools found in the heart of the forest. He was a reclusive wildlife biologist, a man who had long ago abandoned the sterile confines of laboratories and lecture halls for the breathing, living classroom of the wild. He spoke the language of the rustling leaf, the distant hawk cry, the silent posture of a predator. He was not here to manage chaos. He was here to listen to it. He raised his own pair of binoculars, ancient and worn, and a long silence stretched between him and Ranger Rostova. She saw problem. He saw story. Where she saw pathology, he saw pathos. He lowered the binoculars, and his voice was low, a gravelly sound like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. "Hold your team back, Eva," he said, not as a command, but as a plea. "Don't go in there." Rostova turned, her expression a mixture of impatience and reluctant respect. She knew of Thorne, of course, the local legend, the man who thought like a wolf. She considered him a brilliant eccentric, but in this situation, eccentricity was a liability. "Eris, we have a clear window. The cub is exposed. The bobcat is weak. This is the time to act. In an hour, they could move deeper into the rocks, and we lose our chance." But Thorne was shaking his head, his gaze fixed on the distant ledge, though he was no longer looking through the lenses. He was seeing with something else. An intuition honed by decades of silent observation. "She's not a captor," he whispered, more to himself than to Rostova. "She's a mother. Can't you see it? She's starving herself to feed him. That's not an aberration. That's grief. Unimaginable, profound grief." Rostova blinked. The idea was absurd, a sentimental projection onto the brute mechanics of survival. "Eris, that's an animal acting on confused instincts. It's a biological error. We have to intervene based on what we know, not what we want to believe." It was here that the two worlds collided. The world of rules, of textbooks, of human control, and the world of the unseen, the unwritten, the deep, emotional currents that flow beneath the surface of the wild. Thorne turned to face her, and his eyes held a fire she had never seen before. "What we know is what will get them both killed," he said, his voice firm. "You go in there with a tranquilizer gun, and you will confirm every fear she has. You will become the monster she's been hiding from. You will not only sedate her body, you will shatter her mind. And the cub will witness it all. He will learn that humans are a source of terror and violence. No, there is another way, a slower way, a better way." He was the savior, but his methods were not of salvation in the human sense. He did not seek to conquer or capture. He sought to understand. He was proposing to do the one thing that protocol and urgency forbade: to wait, to watch, to earn a trust that, by all accounts, was impossible to gain. He was stepping into the narrative not as a rescuer, but as a diplomat, an ambassador to a nation of two, a kingdom of grief built on a lonely mountain ledge. The slow burn had begun. Eris Thorne did not approach the ledge. He did not make his presence a threat. Instead, he made it a constant, a feature of the landscape as unchanging as the granite boulders and the ancient, twisted junipers. He established a small, unobtrusive camp a significant distance away, a place where he could observe without being perceived as an invader. For days, he simply existed. He would sit for hours on a flat rock, a thermos of tea steaming in the cold air, his movements slow, deliberate, and predictable. He was teaching the grieving bobcat, whom he had begun to call Lyra, a new and radical lesson, that a human could be a creature of peace, a being of stillness. Ranger Rostova and her team maintained a perimeter, their impatience growing with each passing day. To them, Thorne's vigil was a fool's errand, a dangerous and sentimental delusion that was wasting precious time. Eva would watch him through her own binoculars, a knot of frustration tightening in her stomach. He was breaking every rule of wildlife management, gambling the cub's life on a poetic fantasy. But Thorne was operating in a different reality, one governed by emotional, not chronological, time. He was beginning the slow, arduous process of building a bridge across an ocean of fear. From his vantage point, he could see the heartbreaking details of Lyra's world. He watched her shiver with exhaustion, her gaze constantly sweeping the horizon for threats. He saw the way her ears would pin back, her body tensing into a knot of defensive fury whenever a hawk's shadow passed overhead. Her growl was not the sound of aggression he had been taught to recognize in textbooks. It was a low, guttural lament, the sound of a heart breaking over and over again. He began to narrate her story to himself, piecing together the fragments he could see. He imagined her den, the warmth of her tiny, suckling kittens. He felt the cold dread that must have filled her upon returning to find it empty, the scent of the great owl, the predator of the sky, lingering like a phantom. He saw her desperate search, the frantic days and nights spent calling for a response that never came. And then the discovery of this impossible child, this lion cub, Leo, a creature whose vulnerability and orphanhood resonated with the gaping wound in her own soul. She hadn't chosen him. She had been compelled by a force more powerful than hunger, more fundamental than species. It was the biological imperative of a mother, unmoored from its natural target, latching onto the only available vessel for its boundless, agonizing love. Thorne's actions were subtle, almost imperceptible. He would leave a single, high-quality piece of meat on a rock far from her den, but along her known hunting path. It was an offering not of appeasement, but of support. "I'm not here to take from you," his actions said. "I am here to help you." For the first 2 days, she ignored it, her suspicion a palpable force field. On the third day, under the cloak of twilight, he watched through a night vision scope as she approached it, her movements a symphony of caution. She circled it, sniffed it, her body low to the ground. Then, with a speed that defied her weakened state, she snatched it and retreated not to eat it herself, but to carry it back to the ledge. She was still feeding the cub first. It was a moment of such profound, selfless tragedy that it brought a lump to Thorne's throat. He was witnessing a display of maternal devotion so pure, so absolute, that it transcended the boundaries of species. This was the slow burn of trust, a process measured not in hours or days, but in the gradual lessening of fear, in the subtle shift of an ear, in the lengthening moments where her gaze would rest on him without immediate panic. He was not yet a friend, not yet a savior. He was simply becoming a fact, a non-threatening part of her broken world. And for now, that was a victory more significant than any capture could ever be. The patient vigil stretched into a week, then 10 days. The mountain air grew colder, and the urgency in Ranger Rostova's daily radio calls became more pronounced. "Eris, the cub is getting weaker. My sources at the sanctuary say he needs a specific formula, not ground squirrel. You are sanctioning a slow death by malnutrition. We have to move now." Thorne listened, his own heart heavy with the same concern, but his resolve was unshaken. Forcing the issue, he knew, would be a catastrophic failure. The psychological trauma would be as damaging as the physical deprivation. He had to build the bridge, not blast his way across it. His strategy shifted. It was no longer enough to be a passive observer. He had to introduce a new element, a new piece of a story that only he could provide. He had coordinated with the Seraphina sanctuary, the place from which Leo had undoubtedly wandered. He asked for something specific, something that carried a powerful message. 2 days later, a small, vacuum-sealed package was delivered to him at the perimeter. Inside was a piece of burlap cloth, cut from the bedding of the lioness, who was Leo's mother. It was saturated with her scent, a primal signature of identity and belonging. This was Thorne's riskiest move yet. He was introducing a ghost from Leo's past, a scent that could either soothe or completely destabilize the fragile piece on the ledge. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the peaks, Thorne made his slow, deliberate walk to the offering rock. He placed the burlap square beside the usual offering of meat. Then he retreated to his post and waited. The air was thick with tension. He was meddling with forces he could only barely comprehend. As dusk settled, Lyra emerged. Her caution was heightened tonight. She sensed something new, something alien in her territory. She approached the rock, her nose twitching, deciphering the complex new information on the wind. She ignored the meat. Her entire focus was on the small piece of cloth. She lowered her head, sniffing it deeply. Her reaction was immediate and profound. She recoiled as it struck, a low hiss escaping her lips. It was the scent of a rival, a massive predator, another mother. Her first instinct was pure, defensive fury. Her ears flattened. Her body coiled like a spring. Thorne's heart sank. Had he made a terrible miscalculation? But then something shifted. Lyra did not attack the cloth. She did not flee. She stood frozen, her mind, a complex tapestry of instinct and grief, working through an impossible puzzle. She sniffed it again, this time with a deep, shuddering inhalation. The scent was of mother, but not her own. It was the scent of Leo's origin. She looked from the cloth to the small, dozing lion cub on her ledge. A connection was being made, a piece of the puzzle falling into place in a way Thorne could barely dare to hope for. In a movement of stunning gentleness, she nudged the cloth with her nose. Then, carefully, she picked it up in her mouth, as delicately as she would one of her own kittens, and carried it back to the ledge. She did not hoard it or destroy it. She dropped it next to the sleeping cub. She was giving him back a piece of his own identity, a piece of the mother he had lost. From her vehicle, Rostova watched the exchange through her scope, her brow furrowed in disbelief. "What was that?" she murmured into her radio. "What just happened?" Thorne's voice, when it came back, was thick with emotion. "She's not just his guardian," he said, his voice trembling with the weight of the revelation. "She's his historian. She's trying to tell him his own story." The slow burn was intensifying, moving beyond mere tolerance and into the realm of a shared unspoken language, a dialogue of scent and symbol that was more profound than any spoken word. The bridge of trust was being built, one impossible, miraculous plank at a time. The 14th day of the vigil dawned clear and still, the sky a vast, empty canvas of pale blue. A sense of imminence hung in the air, a feeling that the long, patient waiting was about to culminate in something decisive. Eris Thorne felt it in his bones, a hum of energy from the mountain itself. He had seen a subtle shift in Lyra's posture over the last 2 days. The hard, defensive shell was still there, but there were cracks in it now, tiny fissures through which a fragile curiosity was beginning to peek. She would watch him for longer periods, her head tilted, her gaze less a glare of suspicion and more question. Today, he decided, was the day. He would not cross the distance, he would not invade her space, but he would make an offering of himself, a gesture of profound vulnerability. He left his camp without his usual supplies, carrying nothing, his hands empty and open at his sides to show he held no threat. He walked not toward her ledge, but to a place perpendicular to it, a flat expanse of rock bathed in the morning sun, still a safe distance away, but closer than he had ever been before. He did not look at her. That was the key. A direct gaze was a challenge, a threat. Instead, he sat down, his back partially to her, and looked out over the vast canyons below. He was deliberately exposing his most vulnerable side, an act of supreme trust in the wild. And he began to speak, not to her, but to the mountain, to the sky, to the spirit of the place. His voice was a low, soothing monotone, a rhythmic cadence that was more sound than language. He spoke of loss, of the emptiness of a den, of the courage it takes to protect another's child. He wasn't talking to a bobcat. He was speaking to a fellow soul who had known grief. He was offering his own empathy, broadcasting it into the universe, with no expectation of a response. On the ledge, Lyra watched. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to hide the cub, to snarl at this encroaching presence. The human was closer. The danger was greater. She could feel the cub stir behind her, and her protective urges surged like a fire. But the man wasn't looking. His posture was non-threatening. His voice a gentle hum that did not jar the morning's peace. She had watched this creature for 2 weeks. He had brought food, but never approached. He had brought the scent of the cub's mother, but never tried to take him. He was an anomaly, a walking contradiction to everything she knew about his kind. For a full hour, the tableau held. The man, a statue of peaceful intent. The bobcat, a storm of conflict and indecision. Ranger Rostova watched from her post, her hand hovering over the radio, every muscle in her body tense, ready for the moment it all went wrong. And then it happened. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a sudden taming. It was a moment so small, so quiet, that anyone else would have missed it. But to Eris Thorne, it was a miracle, a thunderclap of acceptance that shook him to his core. Lyra stood up. She stretched, a slow, deliberate movement. She looked at the dozing cub, then she looked at the back of the man. She took a single, hesitant step off her ledge onto the open rock. Then another. She did not move towards him. That would be too much, too soon. Instead, she walked to a patch of sun about 20 feet away from him, a space that was still her own, but was undeniably within his sphere of influence. She turned 3 circles, a familiar, comforting ritual, and then she lay down. And for the first time in his presence, she rested her head on her paws, faced him, and closed her eyes. It was a surrender, an act of trust so profound, so absolute, it was breathtaking. In the silent, brutal world of the wild, to close your eyes in the presence of a potential predator is to offer up your life. She was saying, with that single simple action, I will not run. I will not fight. I see you. And I will allow you to be here. A tear traced a path through the dust on Eris Thorne's cheek. He didn't move a muscle, barely dared to breathe, knowing he was a guest in a sacred moment. This was the breakthrough. Not a touch, not a feeding from the hand, but a shared moment of peace. A silent armistice declared between man and beast, a truce brokered by patience and a deep, reverent understanding. The long, slow burn had finally ignited into a flame of hope, a tiny, flickering light on a lonely mountain. The impossible was beginning to happen. The fragile truce, born in a moment of quiet surrender, was about to face its first and most violent test. The sky, which had been so placid and blue, began to curdle. Within hours, the clear canvas was bruised with shades of slate and charcoal. A wind, sharp and cold, began to whip through the canyons, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of snow. A blizzard, unseasonal and savage, was descending upon the Serafina peaks. For the ecosystem, it was a shock. For the little family on the ledge, it was a death sentence. The rock overhang that served as Lyra's den offered meager protection from the sun and rain, but it was nothing against the fury of a full-blown mountain snowstorm. The temperature plummeted. The wind howled with a predatory voice, a sound that resonated with Lyra's deepest fears. This was a monster she could not fight, a threat she could not intimidate. Leo, the lion cub, was a creature of the sun, his ancestry rooted in the warm savannas of Africa. The biting cold was already seeping into his small body, slowing his movements, dulling his spirit. He began to shiver violently, a tremor that Lyra could feel through the rock itself. Panic, cold and sharp, began to pierce through the tentative trust she had built. Her instincts screamed at her, a chaotic chorus of terror. The world was ending. The sky was falling. The human, the strange, quiet man, was surely the cause of this, a harbinger of this new and terrible danger. She retreated to the deepest part of the overhang, pulling the shivering cub with her, her body a tight, defensive coil of fear. She let out a low guttural snarl, not directed at Thorne, but at the world, at the storm, at the cruel fate that had given her a child only to threaten him once more. This was the setback, a relapse into the primal fear that had governed her entire existence. The bridge of trust, so painstakingly constructed, was now swaying violently in the gale-force winds of instinct. From his camp, Eris Thorn watched the storm roll in with a grim sense of destiny. He knew what this meant. He saw the terror in Lyra's posture, the way she had withdrawn completely. Ranger Rostova's voice crackled over the radio, laced with a new, frantic urgency. "Eris, this is it. It's a catastrophe. They will freeze to death by morning. My orders are clear. We are going in. We're going to tranquilize her and get the cub. Now, before we lose the light entirely. This is your last chance to stand down. Acknowledge." Thorn felt the weight of the decision on his shoulders. The logical part of his brain, the part that mirrored Rostova's, agreed. The risk was too great. His patient experiment was about to end in a frozen tragedy. But another part of him, the part that had seen Lyra close her eyes in trust, refused to surrender. To go in now, with force and chaos, in the middle of her terror, would be the ultimate betrayal. It would validate her deepest fears, that the world was hostile, that saviors were monsters in disguise. He took a deep breath, the icy air burning his lungs. This was not the end of his work. This was the final, most crucial stage. "Negative, Eva," he said, his voice a pillar of calm in the screaming wind. "Hold your position. The storm is not the disaster. The storm is the opportunity. It's the final test. If our bond is to mean anything, it has to survive this." Rostova's response was a burst of static and disbelief. To her, he was a madman, sacrificing a life for a principle. But Thorn was already in motion. He was not abandoning them. He was preparing to offer a new, more tangible form of salvation, a choice that would force Lyra to confront her fear and decide, once and for all, who she truly was, and who she believed he was. The stakes had been raised to their absolute limit. It was no longer a question of trust, but of survival itself. The escalating crisis had pushed them to the brink, threatening to extinguish the small flame of hope under an avalanche of ice and snow. The storm was no longer an approaching threat. It was a raging, deafening reality. Snow, thick and wet, swirled in a blinding vortex, erasing the landscape, reducing the world to a maelstrom of white and wind. The temperature had dropped to a lethal level. Eris Thorn worked with a frantic, focused energy, his body numb to the cold, his mind locked on a single purpose. He was not building a trap, he was building an ark. Using a natural depression in the rock face near his own camp, he began constructing a robust, fortified shelter. He piled rocks to create walls, wove fallen juniper branches into a thick insulating roof, and lined the floor with the driest pine needles he could find, covered by his own spare tarps. It was a small, crude cave, a haven of stillness in the heart of the chaos. And he left the entrance open, a dark, welcoming mouth facing directly towards Lyra's exposed ledge. It was an invitation, not a command. A question, not an answer. He would not force her. The choice had to be hers. On the ledge, the situation was dire. Leo's shivering had subsided into a terrifying stillness. His small body was losing the fight against the cold, his life force ebbing away with each gust of wind. Lyra was frantic. She nudged him, licked his fur trying to stimulate circulation, her low growls a sound of pure, maternal desperation. She was a queen with a dying prince, her kingdom crumbling around her. She could feel death in the air, a cold, silent predator more terrifying than any owl. In her panic, her gaze darted wildly. She looked at the dying cub. She looked at the screaming, white abyss of the storm. And then, through a momentary lull in the swirling snow, she saw it. A dark opening, a place of calm, and standing near it, a silhouette of the human, Eris Thorn. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the shelter he had built, his posture one of patient offering. In that moment, Lyra's world, a world of instinct and trauma, was presented with an impossible choice. To stay was certain death. To trust the human, the source of so much of her fear, was a leap into the complete unknown. It was a choice between the terrifyingly familiar and the terrifyingly strange. She looked down at Leo, at his faint, shallow breaths. And the grief, the fierce, protective love that had driven her from the very beginning, made the decision for her. It was a love that was stronger than fear. With a soft chirruping sound, she began to nudge the cub, pushing him gently towards the edge of the ledge. He was weak, barely able to stand. She guided him, her body a living bulwark against the wind, and led him out into the teeth of the blizzard. It was an act of unimaginable faith. From her vehicle, parked at the edge of the perimeter, Ranger Rostova watched through her thermal scope, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw the two small heat signatures leave the ledge. She saw them battling through the snow, the tiny one faltering, the larger one urging it on. They were not moving away from the human. They were moving towards him, towards the shelter he had built. She watched as Lyra guided Leo into the dark opening, and then, after a long, hesitant pause, followed him inside. Rostova lowered the scope, her breath misting in the cold air of her cab. Everything she thought she knew, every protocol, every textbook chapter on animal behavior, had just been rendered meaningless. She had been ready to be a soldier, to fight a battle of force and control. But Eris Thorne had been a diplomat, and he had just won a war with an act of quiet, radical empathy. She picked up her radio, her hand no longer steady. "All units," she said, her voice hovering between awe and disbelief. "Stand down. I repeat, all units, stand down." Thorne was right. He was right. In the eye of the storm, in a tiny man-made den, the most impossible family in the world had just come together. The bond was deepening, forged now not just in grief, but in the crucible of a shared crisis. Inside the small shelter, the roar of the blizzard muted to a distant, muffled howl. The air was still, and a fragile warmth began to gather, a stark contrast to the lethal chaos outside. The three of them, the man, the bobcat, and the lion cub, occupied the small space, a silent, breathing trinity. Eris Thorne sat near the entrance, a windbreak and a guardian, his back to the interior. He did not intrude. He did not try to touch them or speak. His gift was not comfort or affection, but the simple, profound offering of safety. He had built the ark, and now he was letting the passengers find their own peace within it. Deeper inside, Lyra was tending to Leo. The cub, revived by the sudden reprieve from the biting wind, was beginning to stir with more energy. She licked him relentlessly, her rough tongue a tool of resuscitation, her purr a low, rumbling engine of life. For the first time, she felt a different kind of safety. It wasn't the hypervigilant safety she had tried to create on the ledge, a state of constant, exhausting watchfulness. This was a deeper calm, an ability to focus solely on her charge because another, greater power was holding the storm at bay. She looked at the broad, still back of the human. He was the wall. He was the reason the wind could not reach them. A new, complex understanding began to dawn in her consciousness. He was not the storm. He was the shelter from it. This was the silent treaty, the unspoken agreement forged in the heart of the blizzard. Their bond, which had begun as a fragile thread of curiosity, was now being woven into a thick, resilient cable. It was a bond tested by fear and solidified by a shared victory over death. The storm raged for a full day and a night. Throughout the ordeal, the three remained in their respective places, a tableau of quiet respect. When the world outside finally fell silent, and a weak, watery sunlight began to filter through the clouds, the landscape was transformed. The Serafina peaks were draped in a thick, pristine blanket of white, beautiful and deadly. Thorne was the first to emerge, his movement slow and stiff from the cold. He looked back at the shelter. Lyra was at the entrance, blinking in the sudden brightness, Leo a curious, fuzzy head peering out from behind her legs. There was no fear in her eyes now. There was something else. A quiet acknowledgement, a look of shared experience. A little while later, another figure appeared, trudging through the deep snow. It was Ranger Eva Rostova. She carried no rifle, no equipment. Her usual mask of professional authority was gone, replaced by an expression of profound humility. She stopped a respectful distance from Thorne's camp, holding a large, steaming thermos. She didn't speak at first, her gaze traveling from Thorn to the shelter, where the bobcat and the lion cub now sat in the entrance, sunning themselves as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The skeptic had come to see the miracle for herself. "I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own thermal scope," she said, her voice soft with awe. "You saved them, Eris. Not with force, but with... I don't even know what to call it." Thorn took the offered cup of coffee, the warmth seeping into his frozen hands. "Patience," he said simply, "and a little bit of faith in the idea that we're not as different as we think." Rostova nodded, her conversion complete. She was no longer a skeptic. She was a witness. The events of the storm had not just won her over. They had fundamentally altered her understanding of the world. The bond was no longer just between man and bobcat. It had expanded, drawing in the voice of rational doubt and transforming it into a voice of reverent belief. The immediate crisis was over, but a new, more complex reality was dawning with the morning sun. A new chapter was beginning, one that would be written not in opposition, but in collaboration. The aftermath of the blizzard was a period of strange, quiet grace. The world was hushed, blanketed in snow, and the impossible family in Thorn's camp settled into a routine that was both beautiful and heart-wrenchingly temporary. With Ranger Rostova now a full-fledged ally, resources were mobilized not to capture, but to support. High-quality food for Lyra and a special milk formula for Leo were left daily at the Offering Rock, which was no longer a testing ground for trust, but a simple fact of their lives. Lyra had accepted the humans. She no longer saw Thorn or even Rostova as threats, but as partners in her sacred duty of raising Leo. She would allow them to observe from a close, respectful distance, a concession that was in itself a continuing miracle. But as Leo grew stronger, healthier, and more playful on his special diet, a bittersweet reality became more apparent with each passing day. He was a lion. His paws, once tiny and clumsy, were now growing large and powerful. His playful pounces had a new weight to them. His mewling cries were deepening into the first rumblings of a future roar. He belonged with his own kind. Lyra, for all her fierce, devoted love, could not teach him to be the king he was born to be. The decision was made, a consensus reached between Thorn and Rostova, born of love and necessity. They had to begin the process of separation. It would be the kindest cruelty, the most loving act of heartbreak. They had to prepare Lyra to let him go. Thorn knew that a sudden removal would be a trauma on par with the loss of her first litter. It had to be a transition, a story she could understand. The process began with scent, just as the first true connection had. Rostova, coordinating with the Seraphina sanctuary, began bringing cloths scented not just by Leo's mother, but by other lions, other cubs. They would leave these new scents for Lyra to discover. Her reaction was one of deep, contemplative curiosity. She seemed to understand that these were messages from Leo's world, a world beyond their mountain ledge. The next step was sound. From a hidden speaker, they began to play recordings from the sanctuary. The low, rumbling calls of adult lions, the playful yips and growls of other cubs. Leo's reaction was immediate. He would stop, his head cocked, his ears twitching, a deep, instinctual recognition flickering in his eyes. He would call back, a clumsy, high-pitched version of the sounds he was hearing. And Lyra would watch him. She would watch this exchange, this call and response, with a world she could not see, and a profound, maternal sadness seemed to settle over her. She was watching her child hear the call of his own people, and she knew, with an instinct as deep as her grief, that she could not answer it for him. This was the heart-wrenching, delicate process of saying goodbye. It wasn't a plan for capture. It was a carefully orchestrated narrative of homecoming. They were teaching Lyra that letting go was not another loss, but the final, greatest act of her love. Each day, as Leo grew more leonine and Lyra grew more accepting of the inevitable, Thorn's heart ached. He was the architect of this beautiful, impossible bond, and now he had to be the architect of its bittersweet dissolution. He was preparing to break a heart in order to save a life, to honor a love by allowing it to achieve its ultimate, selfless purpose. The bond was being prepared for its final, transcendent test, the test of letting go. The day arrived under a sky the color of a pearl, soft and luminous. There was a stillness in the air, a sense of quiet ceremony. This was the day of the great transition, the final act of the story that had been written on the mountain. The plan was in place, a masterpiece of empathy orchestrated by Thorn and executed by Rostova and the Sanctuary team. There would be no nets, no tranquilizer darts, no cages. The separation would be a choice. Early that morning, the Sanctuary team, moving with a reverence and silence they had learned from Thorn, arrived at the perimeter. With them, they brought not a vehicle, but a single precious piece of Leo's future. A female lion cub from the Sanctuary, slightly older than Leo, playful and confident. She was the ambassador. The final message. They brought the young lioness to a clearing not far from Thorn's camp, a space that Lyra now considered safe territory. Then they retreated, leaving Thorn alone to conduct the final, sacred phase. Thorn sat in his usual spot, a silent pillar of support. Lyra, with Leo at her side, watched as the new cub was released. The little lioness, unafraid, began to bat at a sprig of sagebrush, her movements a perfect mirror of what Leo's should be. Leo saw her. His body went rigid with a recognition that transcended anything he had learned from Lyra. He let out a tentative, questioning chirp. The female cub responded instantly, a playful yip of invitation. It was a conversation in a language Lyra could not speak. She looked at Leo, and she saw the pull of his own kind, an invisible, unbreakable tether drawing him towards his future. She saw that his paws matched the paws of the other cub, that his voice was an echo of hers. He was a lion, and she was not. In that moment of crystalline truth, all the grief, all the love, all the fierce protectiveness of the past weeks coalesced into a single, final act of maternal sacrifice. She did not snarl at the new cub. She did not hold Leo back. She did what only the truest mother could do. She gave him a gentle nudge with her head, a push towards his own destiny. It was a release, a benediction. Go, the gesture said. Go and be who you were born to be. Leo hesitated for a second, looking back at the bobcat who had been his mother, his savior, his entire world. Then, drawn by the irresistible call of his own blood, he bounded forward, pouncing towards the other cub in a clumsy, joyous explosion of belonging. Lyra watched him go. She watched until the two cubs were a tumbling, playful ball of tawny fur, until the Sanctuary team could move in quietly and retrieve them both. She did not move. She just watched, her duty done, her promise fulfilled. When they were gone, she turned, gave Eris Thorn one last long look, a look of understanding, of shared memory, of goodbye. And then she melted back into the rocks, vanishing into the wilderness that was her true home. Her redemption was complete. She had not replaced her lost kittens. She had honored their memory by saving another mother's child. The story concluded not with an ending, but with a transcendence. Leo was successfully reintroduced at the Sanctuary, where he thrived, growing into the magnificent king he was always meant to be. Lyra was seen from time to time, a fleeting glimpse of a sleek, healthy bobcat moving with regal confidence through her mountain domain. A wild queen returned to her throne. And Eris Thorn was left with the memory of a love that defied every law but its own. He would forever be the keeper of an impossible secret, a witness to a miracle that science could not explain. He understood that what he had seen was a testament to a profound, universal truth, that the capacity for love and the pain of grief are not confined by species. They are the fundamental, binding forces of all life, an invisible, sacred thread connecting a grieving bobcat, an orphaned lion, and a patient man, all together under the vast, silent sky of the Serafina Peaks.